Stand by.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Richards, President of the Board of Trustees of the Oxford Community Center. And this evening, I'd like to welcome first Richard Potter, a gentleman who has worked in education for 20 years. His previous positions were at the Dorchester County Public Schools in the College and Career Readiness. He was the Director of Multicultural Affairs at Chesapeake College. He was an adjunct faculty in the Department of Mathematics in the Sojourner Douglas College. Currently, after all of that, he is the program coordinator in Multicultural Student Services at Salisbury University. Richard joined the NAACP about 3 years ago, I think, and he soon was convinced to run for vice president, and shortly after that, became the president of the local Talbot County chapter of the NAACP. In addition to his work there, he is president of Character Counts Midshore, and he's was a former board member of the country school. Thank you, Richard, for being here. And now I am pleased to introduce my good friend and a wonderful lady, Maggie Andersen. Maggie we all know, is married to Richard Rosenfeld, who is not here this evening. We miss him. You live in two different places, Elkton and Oxford, and we're most happy when you're here. Maggie, at the University of Delaware, obviously, taught introductory sociology as well as courses on racial inequality and also on the sociology of race, ethnicity, class, and gender. She's written a number of books, and I had to write them down. I couldn't possibly remember the names. One was called, one of the first I read about was Race and Society, The Enduring American Dilemma. She has another out called Thinking About Women in the 11th edition, an anthology called Race, Class, and Gender in the 10th edition. Then she wrote The Life of African American Art Collector Paul Jones, and a little more recently, one called On Land and Sea, A Century of Women in the Rosenfeld Collection. Pictures from that book became a photo exhibit that Mystic Seaport had opened from May 2017 to September 2018, and then that exhibit moved to the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum from May 2019 till, I think, February 2020. And just recently, I believe it was, she's published the book that we're going to talk about today, or they are going to talk about today, called Getting Smart About Race, An American Conversation. Maggie served in several senior administrative positions at the University of Delaware. She received 2 teaching awards from the University of Delaware. She received a Merit Award for Career Contributions from the Eastern Sociological Society. From the American Sociological Association, she had an award for expanding the boundaries of sociology to include women. And in 2017, Maggie was honored to receive the honorary doctorate from the university in recognition of her scholarship, her teaching, and her service. Now, if one looks up sociology in the dictionary, I quote, "The science or study of the origin, development, organization, and functioning of human society." Fair to say, she has done it all. I give you Maggie Andersen, the Rosenberg Professor of Sociology Emerita.
Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you for that lovely introduction of both me and Richard Potter. And before I forget to give some other thanks also to Liza for helping to organize this today, our wonderful executive director of the Community Center, to Norm Bell, who is chair of the program committee. And I also have to give a shout out to Mystery Loves Company, our local bookstore, which is offering books to the community. They should be available tomorrow. I'm going to go over and sign them. But also, my thanks to Richard Potter for doing this. We actually have never met before this moment other than a brief telephone call this morning. And so this has also given me an opportunity to establish a new colleague as we walk together on this rather tricky path toward racial justice in our complicated society. So I'm going to begin. We're keeping this quite informal, which we agreed to, but I thought I would begin by talking about why I wrote this book. As you've heard, I have been teaching and writing about racial inequality for more years than I would really like to count up in public, but I will confess it's close to 50. I spent most of my career at the University of Delaware, where I taught undergraduate and graduate students, and then also had occasional visiting stints at other institutions. So most of my writing up until fairly recently has been for students and also for my academic peers. And so it's been quite a lot of fun to write a book that is really intended for the general public. When I decided to write this book, it was just after my textbook Race and Society had come out, and a number of people in the Oxford community, including people in this room, saw my book, loved the cover, opened it up, read the first few pages, and said, this was about 2 years ago, this is so important now. But I knew that nobody was going to read a 350-page textbook unless they were required to do it, much less go to all of the footnotes and references. And so it was those conversations with some of you and other friends and colleagues that made me think I should, now in my retirement, write for the general public. I think I know what I'm talking about, and as my husband said to me, well, when you don't know, at least you know who to ask. So I did a lot of asking as I wrote this book as well. So I do hope that this is a book that can inform the public conversation around race, but of course I want more than conversation. I really want action. The book was published in February 2020, and little could I have imagined at that point what would have happened since February. In fact, my publisher shut down for 3 or 4 months, meaning it was a really terrible time to publish a book. So it's lovely to have this opportunity to share it with the public. I am going to be writing a new prologue for the book, and it will then be reissued at the beginning of 2021. My prologue will be called Race in an Age of a Pandemic. And by October, when it's due, I'm hoping things will have settled down a bit, but we certainly know a lot now. We knew very early on of the racial disparities in how the virus is affecting different communities, both African American and Latino communities. And now we have major social change underfoot in people's awareness and activism around racial injustice. And it's very hard to know where that's going to go. I'm sure we'll probably talk about that a bit in our conversation. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity, I hope, to make a tiny little difference, even if it's only right here in Talbot County, to help people think about and learn more about race. So I'm going to pause and let Richard ask me what he would like to ask, and we're going to try to just go back and forth here.
Sure. So I have to admit that when I was reading the book, as I said to you earlier, I fell in love with it. Because I thought, there's not enough white people talking about race. So I appreciate your work. You begin your book with a conundrum. In some ways, you write, there has never been a moment like now in our nation's racial history, yet you suggest, in other ways, this is a moment repeated. Can you talk us through that, and how is history repeating itself, and what is unique about this historical moment?
Wow, that's a huge question, but I knew you'd give me some good ones. First of all, I want to say, let's remember the book was published in February. That means I probably wrote that about this time last year. And as I said, I never could have imagined. What I was thinking of at the time were the outrageous acts of hatred against African Americans. Police shootings is one obvious case, but others. The Patrick Crusius killing of people in the nightclub had just taken place, and we were just witnessing such a rise of white supremacist action, including some words from our own national leadership. And so that was the context I was writing and making that statement in. And I wanted to remind people then that there is such a long history of vigilante justice against African American and Latino people. I use some examples of that in that first part of the book. I have recently been reading a book that is disturbing but wonderful called Wilmington Lies, about the race riots and slaughter of black people in Wilmington, North Carolina at the end of the 19th century. We have, of course, all been hearing more about this as part of the reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests, the Tulsa riots, for example. And so now we can say that though some people may get all upset, oh my gosh, there's looters out there, and we don't even really know who those looters are. The fact is that much of the history of racial violence in this country has been directed by white people against people of color. And I don't have the space in this book to go into detail in that. And I'm not a historian, I only tinker with history. But that's what I meant. People were so shocked at some of the rise of white supremacy because a mere 4 years ago, the conversation was, we're a post-racial society, we elected a black president. Now, those of us who are sociologists and lots of other people really never believed that, but that was the conversation. And so I wanted to frame what people were seeing as shocking in a context of the long history of racial oppression, violence against people of color, and the long history of racial protest.
Right. Good. That leads me to my next question. You maintain that racism is built into society and can be present even when it's not overtly expressed. Can you give us an example?
I'll give you an example of my neighborhood in Elkin, where I live. I live in a lovely neighborhood, middle class, affordable to middle class people, but I am embarrassed to say that neighborhood is, as far as I can tell, 100% white. Now, I know most of my neighbors. I think they're good people. I think if we talked about race, they would not express racist attitudes. I don't think they're prejudiced people. And yet, I'm looking at a lily white environment. So how did that happen? It's not about their attitudes. There are many complex explanations for that. One of them is the history of housing and racism in this society. I happen to know that in my neighborhood many years ago, there were racial covenants built into every housing deed that explicitly forbade black people from buying property there. And then that, as well as a number of other examples, leads to the gap in wealth that we see now comparing black and white families. And so there's no prejudice or overt racism in my community that I can see, and yet I live in a totally segregated environment there. And it wouldn't surprise me if many of you could see the same thing.
Sure. I know your book goes into much more detail about the systematic racism and all of that. So you grew up in a very different racial environment. You were born in Oakland, California, spent formative years in Jim Crow, Georgia, and then your family moved to the Boston area before returning back to Georgia for your high school years. What about your periatic childhood has contributed to your perspective on race?
Everybody loves talking about themselves, so I'm going to try to be reasonable about this. And of course, whenever any of us look back on our past, we can interpret it now from where we sit in the here and now, and so who really knows? But I do think that those different experiences somehow contributed to my becoming a sociologist. So in my Oakland neighborhood, and I will say I lived there from birth until I was 10 years old, what did I know? But I do know that that neighborhood was largely white, largely Norwegian. There were some Asian families. Interestingly enough, it's in the Fruitvale neighborhood, which now is largely black and Latino. I went to Fruitvale Elementary School. So that neighborhood went through a number of the racial transitions that are very familiar in our culture. When I was 10, my dad was transferred, and we did move into the heart of Jim Crow in Rome, Georgia. It was 1958. And now as a 10-year-old girl, all you want to do is fit in, and I would use the word shame, but I really have kind of gotten over the shame part of this, so now it's just embarrassment. I just wanted to fit in. I was in a segregated white school. There was legally mandated segregation, separate schools for so-called colored children and white children. from my perspective in Oakland, I just thought it was all weird, because I was seeing what we now know as the norms of Jim Crow segregation, separate water fountains. I talk about it's funny that I remember this in such detail. My California grandmother came to visit. We got on a public bus in Rome, which itself was unusual for white people because they were basically designed to take black domestic workers into white neighborhoods. And I ran to the back of the bus because that's the place I always liked to sit, California. And my grandmother scolded me, "You're not supposed to be back there." I'm like, what's that about? So I just thought it was odd. We then moved to Boston, and by that time I was in middle school and eventually the first 2 years of high school. And what I remember noticing was even though there was no legally mandated segregation in the suburban schools of Boston, there weren't any black kids around me there either. And that kind of stuck with me. Then when we moved back to Georgia, I finished my last 2 years of high school there. It was my senior year of high school, 1966, when my school was actually formally desegregated. 1966. Now, you'll know this. I don't know if everybody knows it. When was Brown v. Board of Education? That's the test. 1954. So 12 years later. I've subsequently learned by reading a dissertation about my own hometown that the Rome schools were forced to order by a court order from the federal government. You might remember the phrase, "with all deliberate speed." Well, it wasn't very speedy. What that meant was that 4 black students were admitted only to the senior class. Because what I do remember this, it was such a hubbub that people didn't think that young children should play together. Well, it just makes no sense. And there was a terrible uproar about it from some of the parents in my school. And so at some level, this was all sinking in. But honestly, I was clueless. I had no framework for understanding this until I went to college. And I took a course on, I don't remember what it was called, but it was basically on race relations. I was fascinated by it. Later in graduate school, I worked with some of the best sociological race scholars in the country. And so it was both that background and my academic training, and as time developed, my commitment to what we would now call diversity. We weren't calling it that at the time. So I had the good fortune of working with multiracial groups toward causes that we really cared about, largely in education. And I have to say, those informal professional relationships had as much to do in shaping my thinking as the academic learning I was doing. So that was a long answer to your question, but I think those different environments did make a sociologist of me. And also I was teased because I was different. When I moved from California to Georgia, I was called a Yankee. And I thought, Yankee? I thought those were people from New England. And then because I had acquired a little bit of a Southern accent when we went to Boston, my nickname was Dixie. And I was very insulted by that because it was othering me. And so I think I felt that experience of being an other. And, I think that helps build empathy.
Sure.
Anyhow, that was long-winded, Richard.
But that
I'm
was
sorry.
excellent. So I guess, with that, talk more about how that made you feel when you were teased in the South and then you went up north and then you got teased in the north. Like, I guess, share a little bit about, how that...
I was a nerd. I just wanted to get good grades. I mean, that's all I really cared about. I was overweight. I wasn't pretty. In the South, I wasn't a cheerleader. I loved schools in Boston because they were really rigorous. I mean, I am sort of an academic at heart, and I guess that got started early.
Sure. So what would you say to a white person who says they don't see race, that they just see people as people?
My off-the-cuff comment is I want to say they're delusional. But on the other hand, I have heard that so many times from my students, and it comes in different forms. With regard to women, they'll say, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. Or with regard to race, I don't see color, people are just people. But the fact is, race, and that's a long question in and of itself, it shapes everything in this society. And to say you don't see it is to deny the experience that people of color have in our culture. And I know that it's good-hearted people who say that they're trying to live up to the Martin Luther King ideal, judged by the content of one's character, not the color of your skin. And I believe that, but I also think we have to first deal with the racist problems that we have in our culture. We have to recognize race, grapple with it, come to understand it. All right. So can I turn the table a bit
You
here?
certainly
I don't
can.
want this to be all one way. Let's hear a little bit about you. So can you tell us a bit about the work that you're doing
Sure.
in this community?
Sure,
And
absolutely.
we'll just make this back and
So,
forth.
as the president of the NAACP, I took over in about 2014, 2013, and I thought it was going to be an easy ride. And then I received an email one day from a gentleman to say, hey, Richard, what are you going to do about this Confederate monument on the courthouse lawn? And I'm like, there's no Confederate monument on our courthouse lawn. What are you talking about? And he began to tell me a little bit of the brief history. So then we endeavored in 2015 to do we petitioned the Talbot County Council to get rid of that Confederate monument on the courthouse lawn. We definitely stated that, that monument has symbolism of hate for a particular group of people, and that it really has no place on our courthouse lawn anymore. So we've been working to get that statue removed for the last 5 years in total. That's one of the things that we're working on. We're currently working on working in partnership with the Talbot County Public Schools to see how we can recruit more teachers of color to come to the district. We recognize that our communities are growing diverse. They're growing in diverse numbers every day. So we just want to make sure that our students are seeing individuals that look like them. They can build those meaningful and authentic relationships with those teachers so that they can actually have a better educational experience. We're working on that issue. We have started to engage in some housing issues in Talbot County as well. Because again, as you mentioned in your book, there are, racial lines drawn in where, there's African Americans in this community, Latinos in this, and Latinas in this community, and then our whites are in another community. And we know that we need to bring more equity into those communities. So we have endeavored to do that type of work for the last 2 years.
So it's interesting, I want to go back to what you said about the Confederate monument, the rebels in Talbot, in front of the courthouse, ironically, right next to Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
And what I'm seeing in the current moment is an awful lot of change and anger about symbols, right? One of them, Aunt Jemima on the box of pancakes, and there are many more. It's interesting, we haven't heard anything about the Washington football team in this context
Correct.
lately. And I'm curious what you think of this, because on the one hand, as you just said, those symbols are hurtful. There is research I talk about in the book about the actual harm that Native American caricatures cause for the learning of Native children. So we know from the scholarship what harm such symbols can do. But on the other hand, are you concerned that so much of the protest is really looking at the symbolism of things rather than some hearing in public and popular discourse. I've been teaching students for 42 years. And so, but I want that to stick, right?
Sure.
And I'm a little, the young generation is ironically also the generation most likely to say, I don't see race.
Right.
Because they are in friendships that are more multiracial, interracial, and on the one hand, that can lead them to believe race doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
And there's so much segregation in this society, both by race but also by class, that there's not a lot of opportunity for people to cross those boundaries in meaningful ways. I mean, when you look at the data, some of which is in my book, on the percentage of Latino and African American students called majority minority years of schooling, just like in my own biography, there are not opportunities for people to come together. I mean, the one thing we know from years and years of social science research is it's called the contact hypothesis, if anybody wants to get fancy about it. That if you want to make meaningful interracial change, you have to have groups of people of similar social status working together toward a common goal over a period of time, and here's the kicker, with institutional support.
Correct.
And oftentimes you get all of those conditions minus the institutional support. You and I as university administrators know what that's all about.
Absolutely.
But that's key, and that's what creates change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And typically, change comes from outside institutions, not so much inside. Institutions, by their nature, tend to be conservative. They try to preserve themselves.
Yeah.
So the change we've seen has been largely the result of organized social protest.
Correct. I know in your book you talk about we just got finished talking about the data, and in your book you talk about the census. So why does the U.S. Census collect data on race? And given that you have problematized the entire notion of race, do you think that a good thing, the 2020 census kicks off in January, notices the forms will start arriving in the mail in March?
Yeah, you probably should have them, and probably should have already submitted them. I get this question a lot, particularly since we're in the age of the census. Why do we even bother counting race? If race is so problematic, let's just treat people as people. The answer is really simple. If we don't count it and take account of our racial issues, we have no way to know the extent of discrimination, income disparity, neighborhood disparity, I mean, you name it. We need that information to ground our social policies in knowledge moving forward. Now, what's interesting about the census, and if you want to see the detail on this, I'm sorry, you'll have to read this part of the book, is how race is measured. Because if you've filled out your census form for 2020 already, you will see that some groups are identified as races: white people, African American or black people, Hawaiian people, but not Latinos. They're counted as an ethnic group. And so the other thing fascinating about, this can get really nerdy to talk about census and demography people, but categories about race have changed dramatically over years. I know this because I taught in Delaware. There was a time on the back of your Delaware license plate when you were either white, black, or Moor. Those were considered the 3 racial categories. If you look back at census data from the earlier 20th century, you were either black or white. That was it. And depending on what time in the census you look at, you might be Hindu or black or white, or you might be, quote, colored, right? So the categories themselves shift over time, which of course creates nightmares for those of us who like to work with that data. But more significantly, they reflect the politics of race at the time, right? So the reason that we have the ability to check multiracial now in the census is because of the mobilization of groups that insisted on it. All right, so these are deeply political categories, and yet they become fixed in people's minds. Right? The notion of race shifts over time. I argue in the book, some groups become racialized at different moments in history. The most obvious and very painful example of that is the Nazi Holocaust. where Aryan people were created, literally created as a race. But we see that in our own history as well, and I would argue that Latinos, to some extent now, are becoming racialized, right? They're talked about as brown people. And once again, color starts to designate something about people that is really made up and yet has enormous social and political consequences. I tell my students, and then maybe we should pause and see if the audience has questions, but I do tell my students if there's only one thing they take from my class, and I make them chant it just about every week, race is a social construction. And if race is a social construction, then we can socially deconstruct it. But in this nation, we would be deconstructing 400 years of history, which we need to know about.
Right.
I'm just wondering if we have any questions from our virtual audience. Oh, they're being really good. So let's go. Let's do some more.
So why don't white people typically think of themselves as having a race?
Because they've been seen as the norm, the standard, right? They're not the marked people. And they also have what is called now white privilege. There are things they can take for granted that others cannot. There's a wonderful test that I have adapted from two sources. I like to give credit where credit's due. One is a PBS website on race, and the other is a colleague of mine, Peggy McIntosh. And it's really kind of a true-false test, where, and I've done this with students for years, where you give a true or false. I can go to the head of this organization and be pretty well assured that I'll find somebody who looks like me. Very close to my campus, I can find grooming products that people like me would use. My grandparents owned their own home in a nice neighborhood, and I could go through the whole list. So there are typically, when I do this, about 14 questions, and I like to do it in groups where there's enough representation of different groups that you can come up with some meaningful information. Every single time, the white students can say true or white people to just about every statement, whereas the African American, Latino, and even the Asian students can usually only get 2 to 5 true statements. And it shows you how just in everyday life, race is shaping everything that we experience. And for white people, it's an invisible privilege. Now, having said that, I'm immediately thinking of, okay, here comes a stereotype of my own, I apologize. A white working class struggling man who's going, what do you mean? I don't have power and privilege, and he's right. I actually think this dynamic is fueling a lot of the kind of racial resentment we see in our culture right now. So no, that's true. He does not have the same class privilege and doesn't even have the same gender privilege that a white wealthier man might have. But to deny that racism doesn't, or to deny the significance of race even in his experience is misleading, right? But I think a lot of the conflict around race right now is because a lot of people are being hurt by inequality of various forms. And there's a perception among many white people, not necessarily working class people, that people of color are somehow breaking in line without having, paid their dues. Well, boy, if there's anybody who's paid dues, it's black people and increasingly Latino people.
Absolutely, I agree. Some people say that racism equals prejudice plus power. What's insufficient about that equation?
It's not a totally misleading. What I'm trying to do there is make a distinction in prejudice as an individual attitude and racism as a system of advantage and disadvantage. And a lot of people who try to teach that perspective say, well, just tell students it's race, that it's prejudice plus power. And in some ways that gets it, but what I dislike about that formulation is it still puts the emphasis on individuals, not systemic institutions.
So after reading your book, might a white person cringe the next time they are asked to choose Caucasian among the races they might check on a form?
I'm going to turn this one back to you. Have you used the phrase Caucasian and know where it comes from?
I did not know where it came from until after reading your book, which I just thought that was very interesting.
It's one of the ways that a racist history has become regularized. I mean, when I go into a doctor's office, I check a box, white or Caucasian, and I do cringe. And the reason I do, talk about one man having a whole lot of power.
Correct.
Back in the mid-18th century, there was a man whose name is Johann Blumenbach, and like many quasi-intellectuals at the time, he was creating a taxonomy of who were the smartest, most intelligent, most beautiful people. Lots of people were doing this in the mid-18th century because it's tied to the history of the exploitation of African nations, right? Well, this guy, Johann Blumenbach, happened to think that people from the Russian Caucasus were the most beautiful and most intelligent people in the world. And he coined the term Caucasian and put them at the top of the hierarchy of human beings. And now, once I learned that, I'm like, I can't stand that term. And that's why I cringe, and now perhaps you will too, the next time you hear it, because people talk about it, and I wouldn't expect anybody to know 18th century intellectual history and who Johann Blumenbach is until they read my book. But it shows you one person can make a big difference.
Right.
I mean, I would actually like to know more from historians on how that term became so permeating of the Western discourse. And it has to be tied. I mean, mid-18th century, this is the growth and development of the slave trade and European power over other nations. I mean, it's got to be part of that whole system.
What do you mean when you write race is a process and not a thing?
Because race is a social construction. Human beings made up the idea, and they made up the idea to justify a system of slavery and human exploitation. It's just made up, but it's made up for very particular reasons of the history of exploitation. I like my little double helix, which I think is in the end of chapter 1, where I was kind of imagining, you know, a strand of DNA, and if I could draw, I would draw it, where the institution of racial disadvantage is like the main axis, and around that is the concept of race and the ideology of racism, that they are like the frosting on what really the system was doing, which was developing, in the case of the United States and also the Caribbean and Latin America, developing a world economy based on the exploitation of labor.
Right. So I really like the title of your book, Getting Smart About Race. So what does that mean?
Well, first of all, it's interesting. I remember where I was when I came up with the title, because it's really hard to title your book, and I've got a long list of things that were possible, but I was walking actually through Cambridge, Massachusetts, heading to the Harvard Coop, best bookstore in the world probably, and it came to me, it's getting smart about race. So what I mean by that is understanding the systemic nature of racism. Secondly, calling it out when you see it. And third, doing something about it. And most white people are afraid to talk about race. And they're really afraid to talk about race in the presence of people of color. I've seen this in my classrooms. And even in those settings, Asian, Latino, and African American students are also uncomfortable talking about race or having others talk about race because they're afraid they'll get hurt. And so in any group, you have to establish some ground rules, some understandings to make people comfortable with having what are tough conversations, recognizing that people will be hurt, they might be embarrassed. I mean, when I look back at some things I used to think, I'm horrified. But people can change.
Absolutely.
With education. You know, it's no accident that I open my book up with a quote from Joe Biden, another Delaware blue hen. He says, if fear is the problem, knowledge is the answer. I love that quote. I am an educator at heart. Why, is Joe asking us a question?
So we do have an audience question asking for more about how to handle the who, me. I'm not a racist, but out of chapter 3.
Okay, the question was to say more about chapter 3, where I talk about, who, me? I'm not a racist, right? And my answer to that, and I'll be curious what you think too, Richard, I don't think it does us any good to call people out for being a racist, right? I think we have to recognize racism in ourselves as well as in others. As I just said, I think we have to call it out. But labeling people and saying, oh, that's a racist thing to say, simply shuts down the conversation, right? I've learned this from teaching. I mean, believe me, I've had students say some pretty outrageous things. But you have to try to get to where is it they're coming from, you know, and maybe say, you know, I could understand why you might think that. Right. Have you ever considered, so that you pivot that question?
Correct.
What do you
I would
think,
agree.
Richard?
I would agree. In terms of calling it out, I think you have to identify what it was that they had done that wasn't stated equitable or whatever it was, but then you have the opportunity to teach them, and like you said, ask them, have you thought of it this way, to engage them into the conversation. Mm-hmm. Because again, in order to deal with this issue that has been plaguing our country for 400 years or more, we have to build the relationship. And I don't want to shut you down and turn you away, so then you feel like I'm no longer listening to the individual, mm-hmm. or I'm now your enemy because I've embarrassed you. That's not the end result of the game, but to at least open the conversation, get you to think about it differently, and then let's engage each other in authentic dialogue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I make a big case in the last chapter of the book for building empathy. Mm-hmm. It's really mm-hmm. what you're talking about. Understand another's experience. You know, and that is really, really difficult right now because, mm-hmm. you know, this is trite, but our nation is so divided and there's so little ability to talk across political Correct. Perspectives. Correct. And I blame a lot of that on national leadership. And hopefully these new movements that we're seeing can change some of that. I'm not sure they will, but I feel as an educator, that's where I'm making my difference. Absolutely. You know, we can't all be everything. And I think what people have to do is examine themselves, their particular social location. Where can you make a difference? What are your skills? What are your talents? What are your resources? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it may be as easy as supporting an organization. Right now, I think we really got to work on protecting voters. That's a big one. And so what's your particular resource set? What's your particular passion? Right. You know, for me, it's education. That's right. And I'm pretty good at that. Right. But I'm not very good at organizing things, not, you know, movements, and sure. I'm terrible on public policy. But, you know, I can write, I can teach, I can educate. Absolutely. Now, it's possible that the person who's asking this question might be also asking about what I mean by this kind of stunning phrase, common sense racism. And again, I don't want to go into it in great detail, but there are certain refrains that you hear all the time about race and racism. It's not really about race, it's about class. Well, if people would only work harder, it's just really their culture, blah, blah, blah. And I identify those and others in the book as what I call common sense racism. And I say, normally we think of common sense as kind of regular, ordinary, but correct. And what I say is, in this case, they're regular, ordinary refrains of racism, but they are incorrect. And then I talk about each of them in some detail. So I'm not sure if that's also what the, can I say, caller or what the people out there are asking about.
So I do have another question. What do you mean by the term everyday racism? And why does it hurt white people as well as people of color to a different degree and less materially, of course?
Well, the fancy word for it in the scholarship right now is microaggressions, mm-hmm. right? But I mean it a little more fundamentally than that, just the everyday way that people of color are rebuked, ignored, talked over, you know, everyday racism, what you experience. I opened that chapter, and forgive me if people have already read the book and are familiar with it, but it's a phenomenal example of everyday racism that happened to a dear friend of mine. She's African American. She was out to dinner. Over the back of her chair in the restaurant was a beautiful hand-knit scarf that not only I had made for her, but I had designed it. So it's, except for the fact I made one for me too, it's one of two in the world. And so she's enjoying dinner with her husband, who happens to be my co-author, and a white woman walks behind her and takes the scarf from the back of her chair. And then my friend, who, as I was telling you, it can be quite imposing, stood up and said, wait a minute, that's my scarf, giving the white woman the benefit of the doubt that it was an accident, though how this could be an accident, not. And it was not some over-the-counter scarf, right? And the white woman, normally you'd think, oh, if somebody took it, she'd say, oh, I'm so sorry, so sorry. No, she confronted my African-American friend and said, no, it's not yours, it's mine, and continued to walk away with it. Now, as I said, my friend can be imposing when called upon. She just grabbed. That situation is a really good example of everyday racism. Hopefully that doesn't happen all the time. It could have quickly escalated into something very different. And I ask the readers, when I talk about that, to imagine if the race and or gender, and I won't identify them, in a very distinguished position who got very bad service at Scos's restaurant. And you know, you might say, if that happens to you as a white person, oh, it's just bad service. Right. But if it happens to you routinely, it's something else. It's everyday racism. Yeah, they didn't even ask him if he wanted any water. Now, I can tell you if I went in there, they'd ask if I wanted tap, still, sparkling, what wine. Right. He just got a glass of tap water. And maybe that was a one-off, but it isn't if you experience it routinely. And so when white people say, oh, they're just making a race, as Jon Stewart says, another of my favorite quotes in here, if you're sick of racism, if you're sick of hearing about racism, imagine living it. Mm-hmm. Right. You have to, as a white person, not everything every person of color says is true, but you do have to listen and you have to understand and not get defensive and immediately go into denial. Right. You and I have both seen, even in educated institutions, black woman makes a comment in a faculty meeting, everybody talks over her, then a little while later some white guy makes the same point and everybody gives them credit. Correct. And then if the black woman makes a point of it, she's just seen as, well, the old word was uppity, I'm not quite sure what the contemporary equivalent is. She's just wearing race on her sleeve. Correct. I've heard that one. That's everyday racism, and it accumulates to the point of affecting people's physical and mental health. Right. And we're seeing evidence of that unfolding before us right now. Correct. Yeah. So let's do one more.
Sure.
I have another question for you. There are people out there, we think, watching this, listening to this, a few people socially distanced in our audience here. What can people who are listening to this themselves do right here in the place where we all live?
Good question. You know, there's so much that, you know, people can do when it comes to making sure that we're striving to be equitable in our practices in Talbot County. So there was a council meeting this past Tuesday where there was a resolution put forth to start the creation of a diversity statement, diversity training, and then ultimately to produce a diversity report to say, you know, this is how our county is doing when it comes to meeting those expectations. And it did not pass. It did not. It's going to come back up again. But I think, you know, with that just happening and it's relevant and fresh, I think, you know, people who are wanting for our county to become proficient in diversity, write to your council people and tell them that you demand the passage of them, to, one, getting people to develop this diversity statement, two, that there's diversity training that is, you know, held accountable, so it's attached to something, and three, that you want to know how the county's doing. I think we, as people of color, we have to do a better job of, you know, getting involved and staying in that arena. I can remember growing up as a child, I quite frequently were heard, well, we don't do politics, we don't get into politics. And I will say we need to get into politics. People of color need to get into that, need to pay more closer attention. because we are a part of this community and we want the best for this community. So that's one of the urgent things that people can do. Another urgent thing that people can do is write to the council about that Confederate monument. Tell people how it is that it makes you personally feel, because that's important as well.
Yeah. I would add to that, and maybe on this concept of let's make a difference, can say that in the back of the book are a number of resources for people, because sometimes making a difference could be as simple as having people in your home for a conversation, right? To educate those around you that you feel comfortable with, to be doing your own education.
Correct.
And I think there are some resources in the back of the book that can do that. I've also attended at the Y, and unfortunately they had to shut down because of the pandemic. The Talbot Family Council has been sponsoring monthly conversations in the evening there, and they are wonderful. They're led by really young people, for one thing. The first one I went to was just, there were like maybe 2 or 3 white people in the room, all these fabulous young professionals who were Latino, African American. It was a great conversation. That's where I learned about the SCOSA incidents. And so you can get involved. There are organizations both locally as well as nationally, or just do it in your own living room.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I do know that Talbot County, there's other organizations that are having the conversation around race, so you can definitely pop into one of those and, again, just be willing to hear people out and be empathetic and engage in the conversation. But ultimately, ask questions. The more questions you ask around this, the better outcome that you will be produced.
So let me ask you this.
Sure.
Let's move it up to national. If you were elected president of the U.S.,
Oh, wow.
what is the first thing, or what is the main thing you would do to address racial justice in this culture?
So I think the first thing that I would have to look at is reparation, because that's a big thing. The second thing would be immigration, because I don't like what I'm seeing with kids, of course, being kept in cages like they're animals. That just draws my mind back to slavery. I think those would probably be the first 2 things that I would tackle, and then opening up educational access to all students.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we're going to conclude here, but
Okay.
Richard, let me say once again, we have another question before we conclude.
Question, more about the impact of racism on your health.
Okay, the question was more about the impact of racism on your health. That's such a huge question. Look, what we know is and we're seeing it unfolding right before our eyes, but it's not new. This has been true for a long time, that African Americans particularly, we don't have any national data right now on the coronavirus because it's being done state by state. Some states aren't doing it. What we do know from those who have reported it, African Americans are about 3 times more likely to contract the disease and die from it. Latinos about twice as likely. So very much a disparate impact. What we know about health disparities, and believe me, there's a huge amount of research on this. African Americans more likely to suffer from asthma, hypertension, heart disease, on down the list. And that's the precondition that makes African Americans more likely to be suffering from this virus. It's about stress. I mean, the minute you say hypertension, that's stress. There's even a study, I think it's in this book, but it might be in my other book, about who is most likely to be sleep deprived. And interestingly, if you look at both race and gender and ethnicity, it's African American professional women. Now, if you're sleep deprived, we all know that lack of sleep has an impact on your health, right? I don't know what else to say other than it is about poverty has an impact on this, because we know African